You are the exterminator. Only we can tell you what to do.
What is true?
Damn it. You are the exterminator. Only we. Line.
Only we can tell you what is true.
Gotcha. Thanks. You are the extrapolator. Shit. You are the ding dong. Okay. I promise I'll get it right this time. You. You. There is a snatch inside the prison.
Snitch.
What did I say? Snatch? Huh. Well, if you're in the female cells, you can find some snatch. Isn't that right, Mr. Rowland?
Oh my god. Cut.
There is a snitch inside the prison, preparing to testify against our truth. Kill the snitch, and we will let you out. Did I get it right? Am I good to go? Thank you. God, I hate my life. I was supposed to major in agriculture.
Outlast is back. Once again, Red Barrel's newest addition to their flagship franchise has taken the indie horror community by storm. Yes, the Outlast Trials differs from its predecessors in several standout ways. Its co-op functionality, its mechanics, its level structure, but it is also unique in that it is essentially a period piece. The game takes place in 1959, and it shows. The technology, costumes, narrative, and themes all ooze Cold War aesthetics. In a nutshell, the player's progression mirrors the real-world darkness of 1950s America, invoking MKUltra, brainwashing, sleeper agents, psychotics. You know, the good stuff. Gaming Harry has a wonderful video that breaks down the historical context with the game's narrative, so I won't dwell too much on that. But what intrigued me about the Outlast Trials that his video didn't explore too much was the historical context evident in the characters, specifically dialogue, visual references, and other background clues that otherwise might be overlooked. For within these tiny details exists a whole new layer of appreciation for the game.
So how does the Outlast Trials cut its characters from the shroud of history? Let's find out.
The Outlast Trials continues the franchise's penchant for wonderfully weird antagonists. This rogues gallery might be the most colorful yet. So colorful that they dive straight into the realm of black comedy.
I'm such a good cop.
For a smile, you need a... Knock yourself on the screwing, fellas.
Hell, I don't mind a little sweat if it gets me a few tears.
Oh, who invited you to my daughter's tunnel? Good night, everybody.
But when you're not slamming the door in their faces or just plain bullying them, you're listening out for them. Their constant muttering revealing not just their locations, but hints about their backgrounds. This was my first reaction upon hearing this line by one of the grunts.
I smell something pink.
Ew.
But what I only guessed later is that pink, in this context, must have been derived from red, the color associated with communism. And lo and behold, I was right. Pink, and its more pejorative form, pinko, refer to someone who sympathizes with communism, but is not a communist outright. Communism light, if you will. Anti-communist sentiments back then were, lively, to say the least. The Red Scare was the mid-20th century's boogeyman, and with overseas upheavals ranging from Cuba to China, it was easy to stoke fear and suspicion among the average American Joe. Hard work and nationalism turned from values to obsessions.
I just want my goddamn country back.
Calling cards for your fellow patriot, to distinguish you from strangers on the street.
Try to go along. Keep your head down. Do your job.
Strangers who might just be card-carrying commies. So it makes sense that these grunts, big and small, would be poisoned with a burning hatred of communism, their actions justified in the name of patriotism. To Murkoff, the Red Scare was green pastures for blind, murderous dedication. These sentiments are much more exaggerated in the first prime asset, Leland Coyle. His background is wrought with violence and institutional corruption, having joined the Ku Klux Klan, the Marines, and later the police force to both escape legal scrutiny and find an excuse to work out his more, domineering tendencies. Admittedly, his backstory isn't as rich with historical context as the other antagonists, but one of the things we hear from him is the phrase, Goldbricker,
Nearly got this comic over shit talk.
which in this context refers to someone who does less work than they're capable of, while still expecting the same treatment. Another thinly veiled stab at the commie scum. Seriously, call your father a gold-bricking pinko next time you see him and tell me what happens. Another interesting voice line from Coyle comes from his twisted version of the alphabet. At first listen, it just sounds like villainous gibberish, but I was able to identify the initials of a US government or military agency within the letters he says. Worth noting that some of these might be a stretch, but this is what I got.
TPDATFC IAFBIUS PIS DOD SSS USA.
One of Coyle's voice lines mentions Edison killing an elephant, referring to the infamous experiment where a troublesome circus elephant was publicly executed via a 6600-volt surge of electricity, portrayed in a silent film entitled, aptly, Electrocuting an Elephant. Not hard to pinpoint Coyle's fascination with that piece of historical trivia, but while Coyle might seem relatively cut and dry, the same cannot be said for the next prime asset. Phyllis Futterman, aka Mother Gooseberry, is just a treasure trove of character. For context, a history of abuse led to her developing dissociative identity disorder, projecting her deceased father onto a goose puppet she fashioned out of scrap parts. We can start with her surname, Futterman, of Jewish origin, and of a specific insult the Doctor lobs at her during chase sequences.
On your feet, small suffer!
In this context, the Doctor is basically calling his daughter a fat cow, as schmaltz comes from a German word for liquid fat. Considering the Futterman's location in Philadelphia, which saw an immigration surge of Jews around the turn of the 20th century, it's likely the Futtermans are German Jewish, this theory bolstered by the proclivity of dentists among that population. It's also probable that they fled to the United States when things started getting a bit, quirky back in Germany. The history of abuse in their prior life is evident not just in Phyllis's dialogue,
It's best to just let him finish.
but in the Doctor's, especially with a certain word he seems keen on using. Projecting much, Phyllis? After Dr. Futterman's totally non-suspicious death, Phyllis would go on to start a children's variety show called the Mother Gooseberry Hour, leading to her adolescent audience engaging in cultish criminal behavior, allegedly bolstered by the so-called dental drops she sent out via mail orders. It's clear what was in those dental drops. Back in the early 20th century, the use of pure, unregulated cocaine in medicine was very widespread, as it could be administered as a local anesthetic for everyone from ophthalmologists
You do know what you're drinking is meant for eye surgery.
to, well, dentists. 3 guesses how Phyllis was able to easily acquire that much coke. Speaking of dentistry, it's possible her father was in on it too. Take a closer look at who manufactured this chocolate bar you can purchase as room decor. Yeah, I seriously almost busted a gut laughing at this. Sell the children chocolate bars, potentially laced with cocaine, and have them eat so much that they develop not only a coke habit, but also cavities that require dental work. It's clear that the Futtermans were no gold-bricking pinkos. And with the historical fact that early recipes of Coca-Cola featured trace amounts of actual cocaine, the idea of sweets infused with addictive drugs is not that much of a stretch. Cocaine might also explain the lizard-brained murderous rage lapses described in Phyllis's evaluation, as extended use alters the brain chemistry, inducing massive mood swings and homicidal tendencies. And to further hammer it in, Phyllis has an entire musical number about the joys of cocaine.
Anybody says cocaine ain't good, he's a motherfucking liar and a bag of wood. Hey, hey, honey, take a whiff on me.
Amusing as the song is, it's actually an outlastified version of a folk piece dating back to 1930 and possibly earlier, which is about, surprise, surprise, cocaine.
Take a whip on me, take a whip on me, everybody take a whip on me.
When police officers raided Futterland Studios, the place was likened to H.H. Holmes' murder castle. Herman Webster Mudgett, alias Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, was a con artist and insurance fraudster who had purchased an empty lot in Chicago to build a multi-purpose building. This structure would allegedly be used to host and cover up Mudgett's various crimes, ranging from evading creditors to murder! While it is true that Mudgett was convicted for the murder of his business partner Benjamin Pittazel, and implicated in the deaths of at least 20 others, including 2 of Pittazel's own children, the actual murder castle was a product of yellow journalists seeking wild stories, alleging the place to have been booby-trapped, adorned with false doors and hallways, and hosting a crematorium for the disposal of Mudgett's victims. Still, Mudgett's reputation as America's first serial killer, and the mythos surrounding his diabolical building, was persistent enough to carry decades into the future, and to be invoked in the arrest of Phyllis Futterman. So, in conclusion, you're being chased by a coked-up Jewish lady and her father, a goose abuser.
Filing that one away in first time a sentence has ever been said.
Now let's turn our attention to some of the specialist X-Pops. One of them has already attained notoriety in the Outlast fandom as an iconic character, and that's the Pusher, named after the old-fashioned term for a drug dealer. This weirdo, canonically named Frank, has major Jonathan Crane vibes about him. He peddles in psychotropic drugs, he wears a mask that aids in both intimidation and protection, and it's heavily implied that he enjoys getting high off his own supply.
We're gonna take a ride.
Seems pretty straightforward, but ignore the mask and the tank strapped to his back and look down a bit lower. Those leg braces aren't just there to make him walk funny. He's always had them, since even before Murkoff took him in. How do we know this? In 1916, the United States reported its first epidemic of polio. From then on, every summer an outbreak would flare up in at least one part of the country, reaching its boiling point in the 1950s. Before stringent hygiene standards and the polio vaccine were developed, patients, especially children, would suffer immensely. Meningitis, fever, and pain were followed by acute flaccid paralysis, mostly affecting the legs. In decades past, and in countries today without proper medical care, survivors of polio would have reduced usage of their legs, requiring braces to stand upright and walk around. Based on this, it's plausible that Frank the Pusher was a polio survivor who developed a fascination with pharmaceuticals, triggered by his traumatic experience with the disease. Perhaps he feels indebted to them. This, plus his handicap and his weakened overall health, which would have left him at a disadvantage in society, led him to dabble in recreational substances, which is how he picked up slang like,
You're harshing my fucking mellow here.
So the first usage of this phrase was in the 1990s among the West Coast narcotics scene, which makes this an anachronism. However, if the point was to hint that Frank had a history of associating with drug dealers and users, then this could not be more of a clue. Murkoff would then take him off the streets and provide an outlet for his anger and insanity. Roleplay as a doctor and exterminator, preaching the wonders of psychotropic drugs to unfortunate reagents. Speaking of drugs, while the green vaporous gas used by the Pusher and triggered in the various traps throughout the trials is almost certainly LSD, the CIA's substance of choice throughout MKUltra, what's interesting is the in-game antidote that cures a reagent's psychosis. Close examination of the antidote's motto reveals the word chlorpromazine, an antipsychotic and, historically, a known counter to the debilitating effects of LSD. And as long as we're talking about confirmed chemicals, examination of the syringe that revives dead players reveals it contains atropine, a medication historically used to treat poisonings, nerve agent damage, and low heart rate, which explains this line from Easterman.
Oh, if the drugs to restart your heart weren't so cheap, I wouldn't even bother.
Which makes it all the more amusing in context of moments like this.
Just slap some atropine on it, it'll be fine.
Moving on to the other prominent specialist X-Pop, the Night Hunter. While not as charismatic as the Pusher, the Night Hunter is still very interesting in his own right. His dialogue and behavior is more deliberate and self-aware than the other X-Pops. He's shown camping near doors and openly musing about the thrill of the hunt.
What did you think would happen?
He's clearly all there in the head.
Like honey.
At least by comparison. This, combined with his numerous references to the war, tells me that the Night Hunter is a veteran who potentially suffered a psychotic break on the battlefield, resulting in homicidal tendencies and putting him in the hands of Murkoff, who had him play out his demented fantasies as a merciless killer. As for his background, his accent would suggest he's from Russia, or rather, at the time, the Soviet Union. But I have my doubts about this impression. Sure, he has the accent, but otherwise he doesn't reference anywhere specific. Not to mention that from what I can hear, the accent seems to slip whenever he's surprised or hurt.
You can't hide from X-ray eyes.
The other reason I doubt his Russian background is his dialogue. Forget communism or the Soviets. The Night Hunter's dialogue reveals references to American entertainer Sammy Davis Jr., the term shitbird, which originated in the United States Marine Corps, the term gremlins, which originated in the British Royal Air Force, a close ally of the United States in World War II, and, well, listen to this. Say goodnight, Gracie. As in the closing catchphrase from the American TV show, The George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, which ran from 1950 to 1958.
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night.
Good night.
Tell me, what Soviet ex-military man has watched enough of the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show to incorporate their catchphrase into his execution lines?
A really weird one, I'll tell you that. Or, my theory, he's an American soldier, suffering from PTSD, living out his murderous compulsions, LARPing as the enemy, who at the time was the Soviets. Our final topic of interest is the Skinner Man, the mysterious entity that haunts psychotic reagents, inducing pain and eventually death with prolonged contact. While it's widely accepted that he's a demonic representation of Dr. Easterman, made monstrous by the reagent's fear of the man, and that the damage he incurs is actually the player suffering cardiac arrest, it's the psychology behind it that is both unexplored and fascinating. The power of suggestion plays a huge role in collective hallucination, the phenomenon where multiple different individuals report the same experience, one that was never really there. It's clear this is what is happening with the Skinner Man, as the reagent's fear of Dr. Easterman was so prominent and widespread that it was ingrained in their minds as a shared experience. The nature of the Skinner Man harkens to the works of Carl Jung. Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist whose findings would influence psychoanalysis and therapy in the decades to come. The famous Myers-Briggs test is directly influenced by his research. Although Jung died in 1961, he worked up to the very last years in his life. A 1957 publication entitled The Undiscovered Self, detailing his grave concerns of widespread psychological attitudes surrounding the Cold War. But two of his more outstanding contributions are what apply to our tormented reagents. The first is the collective unconscious, the notion that certain thought patterns and ideas are endemic in the human psyche, explaining why similar mythological tropes appear across otherwise very different cultures. The second is the Jungian archetype, derived from the collective unconscious, the actual images and symbols that are endemic in the human psyche. Jung identified four major archetypes: the self, the persona, the anima, and the shadow. In a nutshell, the shadow is the undesirable side of our psyches, the parts that we actively repress in favor of what is kinder to our self-image. With the shadow, repression isn't enough. The psychological impurities become so repugnant that an image is actually projected to the outside. In other words, an internal dark spot mistaken for an external foe. Sure, the reagents feel fear surrounding Easterman, and by extension the Skinner Man, but what else could they be harboring that can manifest as a demonic shadow? Guilt over the terrible experiments they're participating in? Shame over the realization that they're losing their humanity and betraying each other for their own survival? All this spearheaded by the faceless man on the TV? Fear. Guilt. Shame. Easterman. Infecting the poor reagents in the sleep room. Manifesting as a collective hallucination. Activated by even the slightest alteration of their brain chemistry. Enter the shadow. Enter the Skinner Man.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. This was a very fun video to make.
I want to thank these contributors for allowing me to incorporate their content into my project. I really couldn't have done this without them. As for the others whose content that I stole, incorporated, I credited you in the video in the description. Let me know if you want me to do more or plug something. I'm open to that. It's also true that as exhaustive as this video is, I definitely overlooked some historical trivia in the Outlast Trials, so if I missed something or you wanted me to elaborate on something, just let us know in the comments below. I'm sure we could all benefit from what you have to say. And now for some shameless plugs.
You are the viewer. Only we can tell you to support indie horror authors like myself. There is a link inside the description that showcases my novel, Hell's Gulf. Buy the book, and we will let you out.